Welcome to this series on David Ricardo's theory of value. In this first episode, we're going to discuss David Ricardo's taxonomy of value and price. We'll discuss where he shares points of agreement with Adam Smith and where Ricardo begins to set himself apart from Smith. In future episodes, we'll discuss in more detail Ricardo's labor-embodied theory of value, what might be called Ricardian durability effects, the effects of differential rent on Ricardo's theory of value, the effects of differential inborn ability on Ricardo's theory of value, and we'll also discuss the effects of technical change with regard to Ricardo's theory of value. We'll conclude the series by discussing Ricardo's disagreement with Malthus on the theory of value. It was nearly 50 years after Smith published The Wealth of Nations that David Ricardo entered the battlefield of economic theory. The core of his system first appeared in a pamphlet. It was published in 1815, and it was titled Essay on the Influence of a Low Price of Corn and the Profits of Stock. Ricardo's ideas were further expanded in his Principles of Political Economy, which was first published 2 years later in 1817. Its third and final revision was published in 1821. The book was an attempt to clear up those unpolished ideas in Smith, who, for all his virtues, was not a paragon of consistency. Ricardo attends to the theory of value before anything else in his principles. The first chapter is titled On Value. There, he latches onto the labor-embodied theory latent in Smith, rejecting the adding up and labor-commanded theories that were also present in Smith. Ricardo's main contribution to classical value theory is to show how a labor-embodied theory is applicable to class society, and to demonstrate how variations in the durability of capital can account for deviations of commodities' natural prices away from proportionality to the labor embodied in their production. The point of departure for Ricardo's theory of value is in Smith. Before getting to the core of his unique contribution, Ricardo qualifies himself both by, on the one hand, clarifying those elements in Smith's theory which serve as his starting point, and also by specifying the particular conditions under which his theory of value holds. The first concept he borrows from Smith is the distinction between value in use and value in exchange. As we discussed in our series on Adam Smith's theory of value, in common parlance, the value of a commodity refers to its value in use, that is, its utility. The term is used differently in economics. Since Smith, economists have referred to the term value to mean value in exchange, that is, the amount of other commodities any given commodity will tend to exchange for. In addition to bringing up the distinction between value in use and value in exchange, Ricardo invokes Smith's distinction between market price and natural price. Market price is the typical price a commodity tends to exchange for at any static moment in time. The natural price, on the other hand, is the price towards which market price tends to gravitate. The difference between these two kinds of price is that the latter includes a time dimension. Market price is the price a commodity typically sells for during a short period snapshot, whereas natural price is the tendency of the typical selling price over the long period. Value in exchange can be thought of as an entity which underpins natural price. For this reason, Smith and Ricardo's theories of value can be considered what economist Alfred Marshall might call long-period theories of value. The distinction between value in use and value in exchange underlies a distinction Ricardo makes between value and riches. His discussion of value and riches is of a purely positive character. It doesn't carry any normative suggestion, as it did with Smith, of course, who criticized property owners who love to reap where they have never sown and such. Ricardo uses the term riches to mean what value does in common parlance, and which corresponds to what economists would call value in use. Value in exchange, on the other hand, is what economists are speaking of when they refer to value in the singular. Ricardo writes that value, quote, essentially differs from riches, for value depends not on abundance, but on the difficulty or faculty of production. In some senses, value and riches are inverses of one another. Decreases in the value of commodities due to technical innovations increase the riches of a country by increasing productivity, and an increase in riches can indicate a fall in the value of commodities. That's not to say that gifts of nature can't constitute an increase in riches. They clearly can. However, Ricardo is careful to note that, quote, natural agents, although they add greatly to value and use, never add to exchangeable value. Here, Ricardo is driving home the point that value in use does not determine value in exchange. This is a point that was made by Smith and is carried on by Ricardo. Like Smith, Ricardo gives some effort to consider whether or not value in use might be the determinant of value in exchange. After some deliberation, he concludes, like Smith, that it cannot be so. Ricardo agrees with Smith that, quote, utility then is not the measure of exchangeable value, although it is absolutely essential to it. Utility is a necessary quality for a commodity to have a price, but it can't provide a quantitative determinant of its price relative to that of other commodities. This argument was posed by Smith in his famous diamond water paradox. Ricardo does not base his theory of value on scarcity either. Although he admits that the relative prices of non-reproducible goods are determined solely by their scarcity, he qualifies this statement with the point that non-reproducibles, quote, form a very small part of the mass of commodities daily exchanged in the market. It's for this reason that he's perfectly comfortable with restricting his theory of value to the great preponderance of goods that are reproducible. The restriction of Ricardo's theory of value to reproducible goods is a unique qualification that Ricardo builds on top of Smith's foundation. Ricardo's theory of value is not rooted in the utility a commodity imbues or its relative scarcity, but in the labor embodied in its production. He makes his case by calling upon Smith's early and rude state, or as Ricardo prefers to call it, the nation of hunters. The nation of hunters is an economy in which the natural prices of commodities correspond to the, quote, comparative quantity of labor expended in each. This sort of thought experiment will be readily familiar to anybody who's read Smith. In a society where producers own their own tools and can migrate between sectors, a beaver that takes 2 hours to hunt will exchange for 2 deer that can each be hunted for 1 hour. Like Smith, Ricardo also allows for indirect labor embodied in tools and in skills to contribute to the relative prices of the commodities on which their use is expended. For example, if each beaver took an additional hour of planning in order to catch, or if its hunting necessitated the forging of a special arrow, which took 1 hour to craft, the natural price of the beaver would become 3 deer, or say 3 labor hours. In addition to incorporating indirect labor via tools and skills, Ricardo's idea of a quantity of labor, like Smith's idea, includes a hardship component. Mobile producers will be expected to migrate away from less desirable work until remuneration for that work is deemed sufficient to compensate workers for its lesser degree of desirability, at which point producers will cease to migrate away from it. This too is drawn right from Smith. I'd like to note that some critics have objected to the introduction of hardship into Smith and Ricardo's theory of value on the grounds that it constitutes a tautology. One respected economist has argued that saying varying degrees of hardship in labor are, to quote him, determined by the higgling of the market is circular reasoning. If you're trying to explain value by something other than value, by quantity or something, it's no use involving value to explain value. What this criticism seems to miss is that varying degrees of hardship in labor are not determined by market forces at all. The typical preference for some kinds of work over others exists outside considerations of income. Presumably, there are some activities which, on average, tend to be more enjoyable than others to begin with. The willingness of laborers to take a pay cut in order to do more agreeable work is a reflection of a pre-existing preference, a preference which is reflected in higher rates of return per unit of time, but is not caused by it. Having grounded his theory in the mobility of labor exemplified in Smith's early and rude state, Ricardo is careful to restrict the scope of his theory to those locales between which producers are free to migrate. Imagine, for example, that the grounds for beaver hunting and deer hunting were each in different countries, separated by a near impassable body of water. The mobility of laborers would be restricted between these countries, preventing the flow of hunters that would equalize rates of return per unit of labor between the beaver and deer hunting sectors. As such, Ricardo indicated in his writings on the principle of comparative advantage in international trade that he didn't expect his theory of value to apply between national borders. So, in addition to the restriction of his theory of value to reproducible goods, its restriction to sectors within a given country constitute another novel qualification to Ricardo's theory of value that wasn't present in Smith. In this video, we've discussed Ricardo's points of agreement with Smith. Ricardo takes from Smith the distinction between use value and exchange value. He also takes from Smith this distinction between market price and natural price. Ricardo agrees with Smith that in what Smith would call an early and rude state, or what Ricardo would call a nation of hunters, the labor-embodied theory of value is a reasonable starting point. Ricardo also introduces some important qualifications to the labor-embodied theory in Smith's early and rude state. He says that it's necessary that the goods considered by the theory of value be restricted to those that can be reproduced, and that the theory of value can't apply to goods that are not reproducible. Likewise, Ricardo agrees that the theory of value can't apply between countries. The labor-embodied theory can't apply across jurisdictions between which there's no mobility of labor. This is the point at which Smith would say to Ricardo, let's stop here. The labor-embodied theory can't apply to a society where there are profits and capital, and it can't apply to a society where there's rent and land. As soon as there's private property, as soon as there's class divisions, Smith would say, you can no longer apply the labor-embodied theory. That's where Ricardo would disagree with him. Ricardo makes the case that the labor-embodied theory does apply to class society. He extends the labor-embodied theory into capitalism. That's what we're going to discuss in the next episode. If you're a graduate student or a professor studying economics, particularly history of economic thought, and you have some interesting work you'd be willing to share with me, I'd like to speak with you. Please reach out to me by filling out the form linked in the description of this episode. If you're studying economics at the undergraduate or the high school level and you're in need of a tutor, I may be able to help you. You can get in contact with me by filling out that same form. If you'd like to see more content like this, where I discuss various topics in the history of economic thought, please consider checking out my YouTube channel. See you in the next episode.